good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. Art Basel Conversations, beginning of an exciting week. This talk is called Museums in a Global Narrative. We're very grateful to have Manuel Rabaté, director of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and Richard Armstrong, director of the Guggenheim Museum, to join us today with Jane Morris, editor-at-large at Art Newspaper and Cultureshock in London. Thank you all for joining us, and please join us in welcoming all the speakers.
Thank you very much, Mari. It's 20 years since the Guggenheim opened the Guggenheim Bilbao in 1997, and I think at that point it was, without question, the most famous example of a branded museum that really changed the image of a city outside the home city of the museum. I say the most famous, but perhaps with the arrival of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, we have another contender for that crown. The Louvre and the Guggenheim, though, are not the only museums that are investigating these kind of international partnerships. Many of you may be aware that the V&A, the Smithsonian, and the Pompidou have all looked into or are enacting similar kind of arrangements. And then there are other museums like the British Museum. Although they haven't been working on a British Museum named project, they have been offering advice, loans, and so forth for fees in the international arena. What's interesting, though, is that these projects, in the case of these two, started many years ago. I mean, the Guggenheim Bilbao was very much a product of the 1990s. I believe the planning for the Louvre Abu Dhabi started in the early 2000s. And we're working in a very different political climate, I think, than where we were in the 90s and 2000s. I mean, at that point, I think there was a feeling, very, very positive, maybe even utopian feelings about economic globalization. And there was also very utopian feelings about the idea of cultural globalism. Now, of course, as we know, some of the downsides of globalization are becoming much more apparent. And we're working in a much more difficult economic and political era, I would say. So the question, I think that one of the questions we want to look at today is this a time for museums to rethink these kind of cultural expansions, or is it a time for museums to reassert the kind of universal values of art and culture? I'm delighted to have Richard Armstrong and Manuel Rabaté to discuss this with me. What I'd just quite like to do at the beginning, though, is just for a bit of background, in case any of you aren't so familiar with these projects, is just ask both of them to tell us a little bit about the work they've been doing. And I'd quite like to start with you, Richard. If we could go back to the 90s and the planning of the Guggenheim Bilbao, what was the sort of motivation for that? I mean, was it about generating, for example, new revenue streams, or were there other ideas?
Well, remember, I wasn't there, but
No, I sure.
my impression is that it was a demonstration of leadership on the part of the Basque government in particular to help change their city. And one of the catalysts that they most focused energy and capital on was making an art museum. And by good happenstance, the Guggenheim had very warm relations with Spain, particularly through a curator called Carmen Jimenez. The two parties came together, and I think they saw things in a very common way. And my predecessor, Tom Krenz, had a big vision about how the museum could be a tremendous attribute to this city, which is quite attractive, but was going through a bad moment of economic retraction because of the collapse of steel. So your question about, are we in a different era? Not necessarily. Remember also at the opening of that museum, the Basque separatists tried to assassinate the king, and there was still very big violence going on in Bilbao proper. So Bilbao was, to my mind, a demonstration on the part of very strong political leaders that a museum would be central to a new identity of the city. They have already a wonderful museum, the Fine Arts Museum, not only just a few blocks away, but this would be a symbol of a new ambition. And also, the city hadn't previously brought itself to the banks of the river because the river was really for commerce and pollution, essentially. So it was a demonstration of the new power of that beautiful river. I would say one of the footnotes, the Guggenheim Museum was unusual because when it began in 1939, when it was incorporated by the founder, in the papers for the incorporation, it talked about the museum being at more than one site. So even in 1939, the founder was thinking it might be in more than one place. I think he imagined it would always be in New York, but possibly at more than one place. Then in 1979, Peggy Guggenheim gives her collection to the foundation in New York. So you might argue that that's the beginning of centralized museums having spaces elsewhere, in Venice, that is.
The Guggenheim Bilbao was part of an enormous regional and citywide master plan, though, wasn't it? I mean, the airport was rebuilt, huge transport links, the docks were cleaned up, and so on. There's been a number of projects or attempted projects by the Guggenheim to do something similar in cities from Rio to Helsinki. And really, apart from Abu Dhabi, none of those have really sort of stuck. No. And I wondered what was special about Bilbao and we hope Abu Dhabi.
I think they had courage, and I think our friends in Abu Dhabi have. And I think they had continuous political leadership that understood the value of what was happening. When you mentioned Helsinki, for us, a big disappointment, but an early harbinger of the hatred of international efforts generally.
Yeah.
So the missing link in the ones that didn't work was there courage, was there great political leadership, because that's necessary in all these places.
The Abu Dhabi master plan, which the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is part of, that was actually, the museum part of that, I think, was actually masterminded by Thomas Krenz.
It was, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi fits into the plan? Is it for 5 museums or 3?
Well, now it'll be 3. It would be the beautiful Louvre, which opened in November. Soon comes a museum of national history called Sheikh Zayed Museum, designed by Norman Foster. And then finally would come Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, designed by Frank Gehry. That's one of the images in the cycle at the end. The fantasy building is the Abu Dhabi building.
But at one point, I believe there was hopes that it might be open even as early as 2012. And that hasn't happened.
No.
So I wondered kind of if you could tell us what's been happening.
There's been, I'd say, some interventions of reality. One, the change in oil price. Another, the change in the political climate in the region, which was quite different than it had been even 10 years ago. And then finally, I think our friends in Abu Dhabi recognized the magnitude of building the Louvre and organizing the Louvre was really quite a challenge from both sides, and therefore our museum could come slightly later and benefit from what they learned. So that's how I'd say that's how it slowed down. But I also want to warn you that the Guggenheim that we know in Fifth Avenue took 16 years.
Yeah. Okay. Was that from breaking ground to finish, or from thinking to finish?
No, that was from drawings by Frank Lloyd Wright until completion of building, admitting that World War II happened also.
Fair enough. The Frank Gehry building, I understand, is a very substantial building. I mean, there's been various reports on the sizes, but my understanding is it's 40,000 square meters, something like that.
A little bigger than that. But if you look at it, there's this, really we're talking about, when you use that number, we're talking about the space inside these cones, and they're not really typically places where art would be presented. They're much more social. So when you look only at the spaces where art would be presented, it's really quite digestible.
Okay. And you're obviously hoping for a lot of visitors. I mean, these are major new museums. What kind of visitor numbers are you hoping for, and do you think you can achieve it?
Well, long ago, our projection was 3 million. Now I think Louvre probably will demonstrate that that's quite possible.
3 million a year. Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to come on to the Louvre visitor figures in a moment. So, Manuel, perhaps again, for those who haven't been lucky enough to see it or or know so much about the project, or I'm sure a lot of this audience do know about it, could you just explain a little bit about the founding of the Louvre Abu Dhabi project? It was an intergovernmental arrangement, this one, wasn't it, between the French and the Abu Dhabi governments?
Absolutely. The starting point, I think, is indeed in this master plan. You have Saadiyat, which is a natural island on Abu Dhabi, and in this island, there is this district, the cultural district, in which we have these 3 museums. When Abu Dhabi was looking for partners, for expertise, for also access to collection, to build this cultural district and let's say to drastically change the scene of Abu Dhabi, one of the very strong partner was the French government. So indeed, it's an intergovernmental agreement, which means it has a diplomatic level between Abu Dhabi and Paris. What does it mean? It has a duration that I guess no private contract could offer. We are talking about 30 years on 6 months. I don't know exactly why, but like a full generation. We have a very complex agreement, but which is tackling, let's say, most of the part of the project. Lots of expertise, lots of training, lots of transmission, and a full part on loans, on collection for 10 years. You have loans in what are the permanent galleries. You have this rotation of loans. You have 15 years of exhibitions, so 4 major international exhibitions per year, guaranteed by the French state and the French museums. Not only French exhibition, but using this collection as a starting point. And also, yes, training and facilitating point of view. What is also important to recall to the audience is that with the name of the Louvre, Abu Dhabi got access not only to this incredible museum, sorry for the not only, but it got access to the full system of French museums, which means the room after the Louvre, in a way, if you know Paris, is the Musée d'Orsay, and the room just after, temporally speaking, is the Centre Pompidou, and it's a universal museum, so we need to, Asia is so important for us, so we have Guimet as a part of the deal. We have, of course, Musée du Quai Branly, and we have access to the food world, but we also have access to the royal collection, which are in Versailles, to Rodin, and etc., etc. So you have more than 13 lenders which are mobilized in the agreement. So it's a very, the magnitude of the agreement is also part of the DNA of this intergovernmental part.
How long has the museum got the rights to use the Louvre name in the title?
That's 30 years.
That's 30 years. That's 30 years.
30 years, which started at the signature.
And the budget, I gather, from the Abu Dhabi government is somewhere around the $1 billion mark, $1.1 billion.
It's a budget that you have to take with several streams. Part of it is due to services and expertise which is mobilized, but also part of it is production cost, and also another part of this big figure is creation of a collection by Abu Dhabi. So it's you have investment in the future of Abu Dhabi.
And what surplus there is, where does that go to? Does that go back to the Louvre or to the consortium of French museums? Does it go back to the government?
It depends on each family. Some goes to the French museums, which needs it directly, and some is invested. Acquisition budget are about building. It's a transgenerational gift that Abu Dhabi government is doing now, investing for the next generation. So building a national collection. So for you to understand, in what we call the permanent galleries in the Louvre Abu Dhabi is constituted of 2 very fundamental elements. One is all these loans coming from the 13 French museums, and in parallel, the collection of Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is state-owned, so transgenerational.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about the building? I mean, it was designed by Nouvel. I mean, I think the New York Times called it Arabic Galactic in its style, and it does look a bit like an amazing spaceship come.
First, Jean Nouvel is a total genius, and maybe I'm biased, but I think it's one of his most beautiful achievements. Jean Nouvel is, he calls himself a contextualized architect, and I think he started his relationship with the Arab world a long time ago, so he has really a good understanding, Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, but more than that, he was always interested with the pattern, with the moucharabieh, with the light and on the play on the sun. So for Abu Dhabi, he imagined this Medina, which is the Arabic word for city, on the sea, open on 4 sides to the sea, and he put an incredible dome, which is almost floating, which is an image of this very Islamic pattern of the Duomo. And so he created this very physical experience of walking under the dome. You have 8 layers of stainless steel that let the sun goes as a projector, so it's naturally moving every minute, and so the visitor can really experience a physical sensation of being inside an artwork. Jean Nouvel worked also on the museography, and he really understood the narrative, this universal narrative, and he was also part of making it working between this incredible collection and the building, which is always a challenge in this kind of star architect project.
Can I ask a little bit about the displays? Because I'm guessing that you have not told a straight Western chronology.
Absolutely. So if we go back to the name, Louvre Abu Dhabi, we will have the DNA of the museum. From Louvre, we take the encyclopedic, the universal approach, which is this herbier du monde, this museum, curious, open to the world, let's say in a tradition which started in the 18th century, but we stretch it with Abu Dhabi and with this museum opening today. We stretch it to the point of Abu Dhabi as a hub of the world. So in a way, we would say we tell a connected history of art. So we show connection. So we have a very simple rule, which is chronological approach. So you walk into these galleries and you move into time. So each room, you have 23 rooms, 12 chapters. So at every moment, the visitor can know where he is in a given period of time, and he will see in the same room and sometimes in the very same showcases artworks from different civilizations, but more or less from the same period. He can understand the common points, he can understand the influences, the shared references, and something becomes very obvious at the eyes when you see them together. So Jean Nouvel, for that, working with the curator team, really made a strong, visually effective disposal that invites the visitor to cross. So it's very easy, very light in a way, but you have several layers of understanding.
I mean, you've described a sort of intercultural approach, but I'm wondering, what do you do with some of the more challenging figures in the display? So I'm thinking, for example, one of the star pieces is the David, Napoleon crossing the Alps, but I'm imagining to an Arabic audience, Napoleon, who famously invaded Syria and Egypt and so forth, is seen in a different light. And I wondered how you dealt with that in terms of interpretation.
We tell a story of art. We tell a story which has to be based on historical milestones and important. And Napoleon is one. This painting by David is a fantastic painting of the 19th century. So it is a fact. It is a beautiful painting, and it is one moment in the parcours. It's actually one of the fantastic demonstration of what an historical and political portrait can be. We have George Washington, just close to it. So, actually the audience loves it. It's also very powerful. So it's a David on the horse. So
you mentioned the audience. Your first 6-month figures are in. So how have you done for that first run? And I mean, is it all Western tourists, or are you managing to attract local audiences? I mean, have you done that kind of analysis?
Very good point. We're still learning a lot. We started a barometer, a permanent study from day one to really capture the maximum of data. I'm a little more cautious in terms of targets, and I really want to have one full year to know exactly and to be able to communicate on let's say, art data. What I can share with you in terms of volume, until Ramadan, we had fantastic figures between 2,000 and 5,000 every day, and some crazy days at 10,000. So, which is good for any museum in the world, and excellent for Abu Dhabi and for the UAE. So we're very proud of that. Ramadan, of course, and we knew it had a slowing effect. So we will learn to see how the museum works in summer, for instance, and based on that, we'll adapt. What is very important for us is that we are this meeting point between Louvre and Abu Dhabi, so between the world and Abu Dhabi. So, you have typologies of museums, and some museums are 80-20, like the Louvre in Paris or Orsay are mostly with tourists and
So 80%
no.
tourists.
That's one of the models that I wouldn't have appreciated to have. In our case, we may be in a model which would be 60-40, which means 60% tourists or people passing by. It can be something added to their journey or the reason to come to Abu Dhabi. And 40% today are people resident of the UAE, in which you have the full mix of the UAE, Emirati, expat from all over the world. But we are in this 60-40 now, and when you walk in the galleries, you can really you have all the languages of the world, from the big foreign groups would be from China, India. But the Arab world is very well represented, Gulf, but also full Arab world.
I suppose for both of you, really, I don't think any of you like the word franchise or branch or outpost. So what do you call these projects, and why do them rather than a straightforward consultancy deal?
I think it's better, we don't even use the word deal, so we say we have a partnership, and our goal is to transfer knowledge. So we think that we're doing something that is beyond a typical franchise. And also, when you're entrusted with a great collection in art, it's not happy to have those kinds of words around the proposition. So we say that we're in a constellation.
Okay. What do you say, Manuel?
I would echo the word, Richard is absolutely right. Partnership. It's for the Louvre Abu Dhabi, it's definitely Abu Dhabi own entity. So it is an asset of Abu Dhabi 100%. It has a very special name which gives access to very special expertise, very special artworks, and this is what is the DNA of but it's a meeting point.
But what about the benefits to the home institution? I mean, there must be, to some degree, some financial benefits.
There are financial benefits, but from our side at least, there's been a much deeper benefit in recognizing that what we previously thought of was a kind of global point of view of our museum was in fact quite parochial. So we've used this opportunity, and it's used us as well, to take a certain kind of parochialism and make a much broader program that's benefited New York, it's benefited Bilbao, it's benefited Venice, and it will be eventually robust and happy in Abu Dhabi also.
In such a partnership, it goes both sides. It's not. I think the French museums have learned a lot in the process. And, for instance, the Children's Museum, which is we had an incredible way of experimenting something in Louvre Abu Dhabi, and in the Louvre in Paris, the Petite Galerie that was launched 2 years ago was influenced by the reflection that the Louvre itself was having when giving some consultancy to the Louvre. So you have some back and forth.
But inevitably, there's always a risk as well when you go into partnership with somebody, and there's a risk that you can be dragged into things that aren't even necessarily things that are inside your control. I mean, I'm obviously thinking of some of the protests that happened around workers' rights in the UAE and so forth. So how do you think about managing that risk?
I think if you want to be a citizen of the world, you have to be prepared to engage in those discussions. So, again, even though in that situation it was quite painful for us, we learned a great deal. And I think we had effect also on governmental lawmaking.
So you think you have had an impact?
I think we have. The question is always enforcement of the law. It's a very, very good law. It's a question of enforcement.
To be very clear because the names were on the project, Guggenheim and Louvre were very strongly discussing with Abu Dhabi, and together, everybody together, managed to edict law and regulations. It was called the EPP. So during the work site, you had regulations to protect the workers, and enforcement is a great word, but you need to check. And so the process itself was checked, and it was then published. PricewaterhouseCoopers has been tasked to publish and to have a transparency approach to that. So on a personal level, I'm very proud of what we achieved, because the full cycle of construction has been quite important in that. We made it in a place all over the world. This industry can be, a construction industry can have bad practices, and we pragmatically, on something which is measurable and tangible, obtain some real results, and I think it's positive.
I think that we can all see that there are sort of benefits for the museums involved in the partnership. But what I'm wondering is, we're also very much aware of cultural sensitivities that perhaps we weren't, say, 30, 40 years ago. And what would you say to people who say that you're imposing, I suppose, a Western idea of culture or a Western model of museums on another culture?
I don't think I'd use the word impose, because we were invited. So the leadership of the country thought that was beneficial to its citizens. And as I said previously, I think we've learned something. I hope they have as well. And there are no apologies from our side.
Case of Louvre Abu Dhabi, I mean, come on, visit. It's a universal narrative, and we have artworks from all over the world, dialoguing. So I think it's a very specific narrative which was developed for the Louvre Abu Dhabi, for this place.
I think when the Abu Dhabi project started, there was a great deal of interest in tourism. I mean, there was a tourism strategy, I think, for the whole region. But I get the impression that since the Arab Spring and the uprisings in Yemen and so forth, that has started to change, and that there's perhaps more focus on the engagement of the local communities. I wondered if that was a correct reading of the situation. And if it is, how are you trying to build audiences amongst people who maybe haven't studied art, haven't really visited museums before?
I would say both strategies are still very much in effect. The idea of tourism is huge. I think statistically, Dubai Airport now welcomes more people than Heathrow. And when the Abu Dhabi airport opens, it'll be 40% beyond that. So it's become a great global transit point. Obviously, having attractive cultural sites will change people's idea about being there. But the other issue, which is deeper, is how to acquaint the populace with, a visual civilization that they may not know so much about. And we both, I think, have put a huge effort into that over the last 10 years through programming and temporary exhibitions and on-the-ground expertise and exchange.
Answer at two levels. On the institutional level, the entity leading on this project, the counterpart to Richard and my chain of command, is called DCT, Department of Culture and Tourism. So, which is not unusual in the world to have the equivalent of a ministry gathering these two topics, heritage, culture, and at the same time attractivity of the place. So this is definitely the operator for the project. B, as Richard said, it's about program, it's about preparing, it's about touching the society deep. I mentioned the Children's Museum, which is for us a good way to touch all the schools, all the families, to prepare. In a place in which you don't have that kind of museum, how do you empower also the parents with their kids before going to the museum? This is what we're trying to do in this place. It's working. We had a fantastic program called Student Ambassador, in which we worked with young graduates from all the UAE universities. So we made them proud, and they talked to their friends, to their family, and that was one of the best propagation of interest for the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And this is the only way a museum lives in an ecosystem, so you need to be part of this ecosystem.
And is there any way of measuring success in this area? I mean, it's notoriously difficult.
I think I'd use the same measure that I use at home, which is, did we satisfy the needs of inquisitive people? I wouldn't recommend asking that question on a daily basis. It's really quite a generational ambition.
Both of you are advising the new museums on building long-term sort of permanent collections which will live long after, should the arrangement of the Louvre and the Guggenheim ever end with these museums, so they have their own permanent collections. And I wonder how you're going about that. I mean, Manuel, you're, as you said, drawing from 13 of France's greatest museums, many people would say the world's greatest museums. How are they going to build a collection that in any way matches the 13?
It's a tough mission. Because on top of that, we have a very strong and strict acquisition process, which takes time, and it's normal, and just to assess and to make sure that we keep on. I would say it's about momentum. The strategy is to keep acquiring, to develop the collection. I don't think it's possible to do in the 21st century what was done in the past in all the museums by definition. So it's about relevance, it's about what are the pieces which make sense, it's about cooperation, it's about also being very innovative on the way you structure a collection and to prepare what happens after the French loans.
But is the plan for it to be a universal museum like the museums it's drawing from?
I think absolutely. I mean, Richard mentioned it. You have these 3 museums in this district. One is a connection of Abu Dhabi to the world and to the history, to the long-term history, up to contemporary, but this long-term. The one is about the national identity and the reflection and the Zayed National Museum, and the other one is exploring modern and contemporary time, and I would say also the local and regional scene. This is an ecosystem, it works. So I think Louvre Abu Dhabi could change a little bit his mandate, but definitely we are a universal museum for a long time.
What about you, Richard? Because your collection is going from the 1960s forward, isn't it? The one in Abu Dhabi.
We don't use the word universal because they've taken it. So we say we have a global collection, and we've been very active about seeing what we could bring together over the last 50 years, let's say, that would make a cohesive presentation about the state of the world. I think we've been relatively successful, and we have a few more years before the building opens, so we'll be able to add more.
I mean, it's obviously easier. I mean, prices are obviously an issue, but it's easier in the contemporary field. But obviously there's a lot of museums now that are looking back into their modern collections. I mean, obviously the Tate's doing this, MoMA, the Pompidou. I don't know if the Guggenheim is doing it too, but are you looking to acquire Latin American modernism, Egyptian modernism, and so forth?
Yes, both. Yeah.
So both the modern and the contemporary will be
well represented
collections. Okay. I suppose my final question before we go to questions is, when the Louvre Abu Dhabi arrangement was very first announced, so I say 2006, 2007, I mean, there was media speculation about what you would and wouldn't be allowed to show, and I think there was speculation that you wouldn't be able to show Christian imagery, you wouldn't be able to show nudes. I mean, that didn't, in fact, happen. But we all know that everywhere in the world there are cultural sensitivities, and I wondered how you steer the path between choosing culturally sensitively but not censoring yourselves.
Indeed, it was one of the discussion at the beginning of the project. I think the answer was really achieved thanks to the curatorial and scientific work? I think the answer was not to push the envelope too much or to find or provocative or non-provocative. The question was, what is relevant? What is the story told? What do we say about art history? What do we say about the connection? What is our message? So the scientific team, and that was Henri Loiret was there yesterday in Basel, and I think he really insisted. He was president of the Louvre at this time, and he really insisted in creating a strong curatorial team. So you had the best specialists over 10 years to work on relevancy of this story, of this universal story, and I think that was the answer. And when Jean-Luc Martinez, who's now who had the task to open after Henri, he made exactly the same thing, which is making sure we have the best artworks from all over the world to tell this story. So I would just say, come and see. You will tell me. Come to Abu Dhabi. You would see in the galleries, because it's all about balance. It's all about echo. We also have evolution, because the loans are there for 1 year on the acquisition. So the team is always working, trying things, and come and see.
So you haven't been asked not to show something?
No. The question is, does it work? I mean, it's more like, does it work? What is relevant, and you have balance, you have elements.
What about you, Richard? Because, I mean, contemporary artists can notoriously make challenging works, and including artists in the region very much, who may have political messages or so forth that they would like to put across. How do you deal with that, or how will you deal with that?
Well, so far we've been conscious of sensitivities, but not being self-censoring, I think. And we've always found a good accommodation with our exact partners. Now, we won't know until we present the entire collection and see what the reaction is to it. But so far, I would say we've had no edicts from above that we can't do anything.
I wondered if anyone amongst the audience would like to ask our panel some questions. Oh, great. So the gentleman in the grey-green first, and then this lady at the front.
Just one question, very brief one. When is the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi due to open? But another thing is a comment, and that is that it seems to me that museums' function are changing, and probably have changed quite a lot since your original planning went into being. We visited the museum in Tartu in Estonia a couple of weeks ago, and there you have a museum whose function is to display Estonian history, really, of the world, but it also has restaurants, it has theatres, it has cinemas, it has all sorts of functions that go on besides just looking at collections. And I think that museums more and more are going to find their collections less relevant than their other activities. If you'd care to comment.
Well, that puts us right out of business, because I don't know a thing about restaurants and don't care anything about them. I really think that at the core, museums have to be proud of their own expertise. Yes, a social space, happy about that, and I think the Louvre has demonstrated a beautiful social space. I think our building will have that capacity as well, but we shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that the contents of it are very representative of the highest achievements of culture over the last 65 years, and the world wants to be informed about that. When we open is still unclear, but we know it's at least 4 years away. Yeah.
Now the lady here.
Two questions, really. The first one, how do you define museum? Do you have your own definition of what a museum is? And a related question, what is the key for you in a visitor's museum experience?
Well, I'd say it's a traditional definition of an art museum. There are many kinds of museums, as you know, but at the core, an art museum is an accumulation of objects that people who spent their life looking at and thinking about imagine to be valid for intense scrutiny hundreds of years into the future. So the idea that it's a democratic or egalitarian pursuit is, to my mind, very mistaken. So we have an art museum, and we have an art museum that's being built around expertise.
And I would say also real artworks. I mean, in our case, we do the two basic functions. One is to protect, save, study the artworks, which is the expertise, and the other one is to offer them to the public, which means understanding what they want, to also communicate, publish, explain. So if you have these two, if it's two parts of the mandate, you are in a museum, art museum.
Let me answer the second part. I might have been a little combative in the first part. How do you say that it's a successful visitor-oriented institution? You have to think always, is it pleasurable? That's important. Is it available for all kinds of inquisition? Any person who's inquisitive about anything, does he or she go away feeling, I recognize something, I remember something? And finally, I think you have to say it's a place where people can be civil to one another. So it's important to recognize that it has a role today that might previously have been fulfilled by other kinds of institutions. But it's become, for me, an important place for civil dialogue and also for silence, which is a very precious commodity these days.
To answer the if I try to measure, it really depends on the mission you are the closest to. I can measure the satisfaction by a pool survey, and this is something we monitor. We want people to be happy and to have enjoyed the experience of Louvre Abu Dhabi, and we put ourselves objectives of welcoming the visitors and making sure that the education tool that they could navigate and that the full experience would be good. This is something you can definitely track. On the other mission, which is the education part, the real strong education, it's very hard to measure. How did you transform a visitor? How strongly did they understand? And how do you reach the children? How many? Is it the number of schools? Is it? You cannot question how transformative, how deep and transformative you will be. But we are also trying to track that and to make sure that our education mission is at the core of the museum.
Let me say one more thing, sorry, to my friend here in the front row. We always have to admit to one another that it's not so bad to go to the museum and not learn anything. It's not really necessarily a place where you can learn something. It's really supposed to be, in my mind, a place where you can nourish your imagination. So I don't mind if people have a complete factual misunderstanding of what they're looking at, as long as they sustain themselves from looking at something.
So the lady in the yellow, and then this gentleman at the front here, and then that gentleman there.
Thank you. You've spoken a bit about education and infrastructure. I was wondering what either of your museums are doing in terms of job training, museum management programs, and art history education.
It's definitely at the core of the project. There is a very strong program from the French institution towards the Emirati population and expertise. We are definitely training a new generation of Emirati museum professionals in all the different activities of a museum, some from the core, curators, collection managers, and so on, but also to a very specific job like security, the specific security or facility management in a museum, which are the same thing in other places, but with the museum part. So from the start, we use the 10 years of the project to prepare people who are the staff of the museum and to make sure. And we still are a place in which you learn a lot. So this is for our staff, and we offer plenty of programs to the population in Abu Dhabi.
Same for us. The original motivation from the Emirati side, as I understand it, was transfer of knowledge. So really, I think the leadership there felt the crucial thing was, yes, have a collection, yes, have an attractive building, but most importantly, make the series of professions that make up our world available to young Emiratis as a way of having a life. So to me, that was, as I understood it, the central motivation on their side.
Gentleman over there, yeah.
I'm just curious, given the amount of time it takes to prepare and build these wonderful museums, how does technology and specifically augmented reality and virtual reality play any part in what you're trying to do to connect with your audiences?
Very, very good point. It's like, indeed, each time when you get ready, the screens could be better, and there is a moment in which you need to launch the tender and to get the... in our case, we anticipated technology as one of the education tools, but we didn't want it to conflict with the materiality of the artworks. So basically, we have apps, we have audio, multimedia guides, and so on, which are more on the side, inviting you to go to the artworks, but not in the same visibility. So it's part really of the DNA of the Louvre Abu Dhabi is access, plain access to very precious artifacts. So the multimedia, the virtual reality, all the tools are in a way easy to change and to evolve because they are not the core of the experience. They are bringing you to the artworks.
And I would say also we recognize that people under a certain age in particular absorb information differently, and we have to be in that mode in the future.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Louvre Abu Dhabi. So my understanding is that a part of the collection comes from the French institution, and the other side, there are some temporary exhibition. So does it mean that among the pieces from the French institution, the pieces which are shown will be shown there for at least 10 years, or do they come back to France according to the permanent collection of the Emirati states?
No, good point. They're on loan, but the period of 10 years is the period during which you have French loans. The theoretical date is 1 year per artwork, but for the very fragile, actually, we have them only for 3 months, photography, estampe, and so on. So due to the materiality or textile, 6 months after, we already have done 2 rotations of artworks of the fragile ones, going back to Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Guimet, and so on. So a lot of things have been already changed and evolved. For some of the very massive one, like we have Ramses II from the Louvre, we know it's more than 1 year, and it could be a lot more, or maybe 5 depending. So we have a framework of 10 years, and there is this evolution. We also want to have things moving and tell the story with a different angle.
We're actually coming to the end of our session, I'm afraid. But I had one final question I'd like to ask you. Could you imagine doing this again? Could you imagine creating large architect design projects in, say, Africa? Or would you do a different model?
I think we'd go to Mars.
You go to Mars.
Why not? Why not?
Yeah, okay. On that note, I'd like to say thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to the audience for attending. Thank you.